Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin broadcast number 275 of Demolishing Political Myths Talks, completely live. Thank you very much for joining us, as always, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship. On the other side of the screen, and across the Atlantic Ocean, we're joined by Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, my friend, how's everything over there?
Fernando Moragón, Fernando querido, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bueno, dos cosas hay que decir. Digamos que estas...
Well, two things need to be said. Let's say this is going to delight the people at NATO, but it has to be said, this is indeed a Euro-Atlantic connection. And second, you have to tell us, confess it, you told me before we started, but you were a bit shy about saying it. How many drones did you see on your way there, or how many drones did you come across?
¿Con cuántos drones os habéis encontrado?
Revoloteaban alrededor.
They were swarming around my plane before takeoff, hanging Russian flags, photos of Putin, confetti, shredded paper. Well, I've seen it all out there. And by the way, for that reason, or with that context in the background, the outrageous statements made today by Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels about the war in Ukraine, or better yet, about the war in Europe. Because today, my dear Fernando, it basically began formally. Today the war between Europe and Russia began, right?
Entre Europa y Rusia, ¿sí? Alguien podría responder que ya comenzó.
Someone might say it actually started some time ago. But well, like World War I with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, if I remember the name correctly, the Archduke of Austria in Sarajevo. Well, today would be the official day, the Crown Prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Indeed, today marks the formal beginning. So that's our topic for today. But before that, I wanted to show a few short clips of my arrival here. Almost. The flight was very long, as always, so I spent almost a day without connection. And upon my arrival, I was hoping for some fresh air, some rationality, some contrast to the European madness. However, this is the scene I found here. Attention. Well, anything is possible. A concert by Javier Milei, the Argentine president, dedicated to this.
El presidente argentino dedicado a esto.
Man, I think he might have more success with this, because with his economic reforms, he's wrecking Argentina. This is more harmless.
Sí, de todas maneras desastroso cantando también, pero el país en...
Yes, in any case, disastrous. Singing too, but the country is in flames. The economy on the verge of collapse. What a disaster. To top it off, singing a song by Charlie Garcia, who would never endorse this. But well, an Argentine musician very famous here, and throughout Latin America too. On top of that, besieged by corruption allegations, the latest involving the main candidate from his party in the upcoming elections, proven to be connected to drug trafficking, he had to step down just yesterday, finally, after numerous accusations and evidence coming from Milei's own Mecca, the United States. The US justice system itself determined that a drug lord, a leader of international drug trafficking linked to the Sinaloa cartel, made a transfer, this proven and documented by US authorities, of $200,000 to the personal account of Milei's main candidate for the elections. That's how subtle everything is. That's why, after some truly incredible days, during which he appeared on shows, seeking to defend himself on programs friendly to the major media, when asked, "Sir, did you receive $200,000 from Fred Machado, the drug lord in question?" he wouldn't answer. "I'm not going to answer questions, I'm not going to respond to insults," he said, instead of simply replying, "No." Why not? Because the money does, in fact, show up. It appeared in the accounts. And in that context, Milei then started this, right? A rock concert.
I see here it says, why am I a capitalist? And he's a capitalist because he sings rock. I don't see the connection, huh, between rock and capitalism. Rock is doing fine, and especially that kind of rock like heavy metal and such, tends to be more rebellious. But anyway.
And in Latin America even more so, tied to the struggles against dictatorial governments. There he is, selling his book. A book, Javier, The Construction of the Miracle. And if you want more, Fernando, for the closing, this scene right here. Pay attention to this, huh?
Pay attention to this.
Ah, sí. Ahí lo acompañan como coristas.
Ah, yes. There she is, accompanying him as a backup singer. Lemoyne, Lila Lemoyne, if I remember correctly. She was originally his makeup artist. Here he is, well, singing this Hebrew song. I can't recall the name right now, but it's a famous one. That's his makeup artist, who later became one of his main candidates for parliament. A brute, an ignorant person, can't string two sentences together, always insulting people. And she joined him singing in the choir because on top of that, the guy's a bad singer. Well, it was simply a way of showing off, like, look, I made it here with Milai's makeup artist. I don't know who else was there.
And look, I sing badly, okay? Really badly. I mean, this is worse than me. Sorry, I don't know what came over me there. Some stuff from when I was young. But come on, it was awful. I don't know what's worse. Let's see. In Argentina, you've got a problem, huh? And a big one. What's worse? That Milei wrecks the economy, or that he launches a psychological attack of cognitive engineering with songs and leaves everyone messed up like in the head? You've got a serious problem there. And then there's something else. I don't know if... Well, I haven't been able to gather information. If Trump, given that he's in a frenzied fight against drug trafficking, besides attacking Venezuela, is now going to attack Argentina, now that it's been proven they're involved, right? Some bombings, maybe? Nobody knows. What do you think?
The degree of, if the bomb were falling on Milei's head, in that case, I would support Trump's decision. But beyond the jokes, Fernando, around Milei there's his sister, accused of corruption. Almost proven, because the accusations actually began within Milei's own inner circle of collaborators, and his sister stands by him. Milei can't leave her because she serves as his nurse. Since Milei has psychological problems, you might remember the images. He soiled himself, had panic attacks, fits of rage, well, mystical delusions. His sister, until not long ago, dedicated to selling cakes on Instagram, and the medium responsible for contacting Milei's dead dog in space, accompanies him as one of his close aides. The other one, that girl singing behind him, Lemoyne, Lila Lemoyne, his makeup artist, who was also previously involved in that activity of anime fanatics. What do they call that?
Dressed up as anime characters. Yeah, I don't remember the name, but yeah, they dress up as anime characters.
Exactly. That was his main activity before his leap to Parliament, and until a day ago, his main candidate for the midterm elections. An unpresentable figure, proven to be linked to narcopolitics, receiving money from a drug trafficker, according to the United States itself. It's the level of, if this were a movie, you'd say, incredulous. No, that's insane. What a farce. Well, that's the government of Argentina.
Qué payasada. Bueno, es el gobierno de Argentina.
But it has one good thing, meaning these kinds of things that also happen in Europe highlight just how much the masks have already fallen. And what we call liberal democracy is not democracy. It's liberal, but it's not democratic. They are liberal oligarchies or oligarchic republics. It makes no difference whether they are constitutional monarchies or republics. That's less obvious. It's the scam of liberal democracy. Does anyone really believe that the people who run in the major parties, who can become presidents or prime ministers and control parliament, are doing it to serve the population? Are there still some who believe that? They run for office to steal, as we're seeing in the case of the narco west of a province over there. Espert, Jose Luis Espert, that makeup artist, because it's been seen that she was the makeup artist of a madman who became president and said, "Here I am to cash in. I'm running for Congress to steal whatever I can. Well, this is the same thing. That's what politics is. Unfortunately, politics, understood in liberal terms, as all these people see it, is a way to get rich quickly, in Europe and so on, and to live wonderfully. Also like Mrs. von der Leyen, that is, Mrs. von der Leyen lives wonderfully while denying abundance. Let's see her big deal with Pfizer and others out there, smaller ones, the huge salary she has, all the perks and so on. Well, of course she's there. And in the end, since Mrs. von der Leyen doesn't have the brains to design even a minimally coherent anti-Russian program, she just does what she's told. Well, that's what they're there for, to get rich at the expense of the citizens. That's why I argue. But well, everyone can do as they please. In my particular case, I believe that voting only perpetuates a system that's becoming more and more degenerate in every way. And we can already see that, ultimately, because of the sheep-like behavior of voters, of the population in general, of the citizens here too, we end up letting increasingly bizarre people rise to power, as often happens. More surreal, more Kafkaesque people. That is to say, just like von der Leyen and company, like Elena Barbu, like other more surreal figures. I mean, well...
Here, dear Fernando, speaking of surrealism, a few images of it. We didn't want to start with this, but, well, it somehow serves as an introduction to, well, the dearly beloved Lila Lemoine in the past.
Dressed as a superhero or something like that.
Yes, exactly, from She-Ra, He-Man's sister. When I was little, I used to watch the He-Man cartoons. Well, this is his sister, She-Ra. This congresswoman is practically the leader of Millei's ruling political party in Congress. Any more images of this lady's activities? Of a political intellectual? Man, I'd insist that it be that way.
If only it were so.
Disguised as what? Disguised, if I remember correctly. He called it a superhero he invented himself, named Captain Freedom. Here, Javier Milei dressed up as a superhero to take on the Keynesians. This was before his election as president. This is our president dressed as a clown, basically a jester. An occupation government, but with a clown. This is the reality of my beloved country. Fortunately, before long, these gentlemen will leave the government. Over here, more images of the beloved. Well, no, any around here.
Man, the thing is, these people, dear Lila.
Yes, no, and completely in debt, because that's the goal, basically. Here, Lila Lemoine. Her characters are right there in plain sight. This is her activity. All right.
This is an example that anyone, even the most humble person, can become a member of parliament. Because deep down, liberal democracy works. There's movement between people, right? The poorest can become a member of parliament, the craziest can become president. What more could you ask for? I mean, of course, why don't they choose me for something? I don't care what it is. It would solve my life. I'd stop being poor. Something like that would change my life. I'm willing, if necessary, to dress up as whatever it takes. You know, I've got no problem with that.
Even with Lila Lemoine's low-cut tops, too.
I put on a spectacular low-cut top. Now that I'm a bit chubby and all, you can't imagine. I mean, I wear a neckline down to my belly button.
Furthermore, the level of ideological delusion in one of the many speeches delivered at that rock concert portrayed the left, that phantasmagorical entity in Millei's mind, as the murderer of Charlie Kirk. And after that, they began with the Hebrew song Hava Nagila, when in fact, members of the political movement known as MAGA of Trumpism are themselves presenting evidence of the possible involvement of Israeli intelligence services in Charlie Kirk's murder.
servicios de inteligencia israelíes en el asesinato de Charlie Kirk, ¿sí?
Candice Owens, la periodista
Candace Owens, the Republican journalist, Trump supporter, etc., etc. I was watching a video and she was saying it very clearly. I mean, she said it herself. Charlie Kirk, in his latest conversations on social media and so on, said that he was standing firm, that for defending certain things, Zionist donors had withdrawn up to $2 million from him, which is no small thing, but that he was willing to stick to his beliefs and that he was disappointed in the state of Israel, that he was realizing all of this was a scam. 48 hours later, he was murdered. Kanye is the one saying this. Pretty wild, huh?
Bueno, pero como Milei sin una palabra de inglés.
So, it can be seen anywhere, right? Well, but since Milei doesn't speak a word of English, obviously he didn't see this. And for him, it was the left who actually perpetrated the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And well, his idol Trump also harassed by the international left. Bolsonaro, the attempted assassination of Bolsonaro years ago, also by the left. And the country, according to him, the country here, Argentina, in some sort of economic miracle, when until recently it was on the verge of a currency run, delayed just a few weeks by the fictitious announcement of a bailout from Trump. But that gave the government a bit of breathing room, as it continues in a constant flight forward. Economic crisis, imminent collapse, IMF bailout through the repatriation of undeclared foreign assets by Argentinians abroad, bailout from Trump.
Well, anyway, he won't be able to last much longer. Yeah, until the next elections, right?
Until October, until now. After that, surely a terrible devaluation, which means another disaster. But he keeps hammering on and on about Argentina's economic miracle, a parallel reality, in Narnia, these guys, in Narnia. Something similar to what's happening in Europe, Fernando, because Ursula von der Leyen's words today are also in Narnia. Only here, at least, without the risk of a war against Russia. That's the difference.
Yes, but well, politicians in the West gave up on staying connected to reality a long time ago. No. You know, that idea that if reality doesn't match your narrative, then you adjust reality to fit your narrative, not the other way around. That's where we are.
The concept of cognitive dissonance is indeed that. That's where we are. Fernando, let's start with the important topic.
One moment a Russian drone is flying over me. It's gone now. We can continue.
Ah, this one. Yes, over here transatlantic, just seen as well.
What speed? These are the hypersonic ones. Wow. As you can see, right now in the streets of Madrid, you have to dodge drones. There are so many of them. Yes, dodging. You can't avoid it. But well, that's how it is. Good thing Ushuaia is going to save us with its anti-drone wall.
This is today's speech. It's already more tragicomic because basically in her address, she made a declaration of war. That's how today's speech in Brussels by Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, began at the Assembly of MEPs, the Community Parliament. Sorry, here she's being introduced. And to top it off, before the declaration of war, in the context of pop politics, on one hand a warlike speech, but on the other, the sweet, cheerful touch of this lady being introduced as follows. I give the floor to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and I take this opportunity to wish her a very happy birthday.
Oh, how sweet, oh, how moving.
I'm getting emotional. War and tenderness, Fernando. They link human emotions from one extreme to the other.
Spectacular. The point is to make people stop thinking, to free them from emotions.
She standing there smiling, and from this moment on, the President begins her speech. President, honourable members, ministers, and so on.
And dangerous is happening in our skies.
Algo nuevo y peligroso está sucediendo.
Something new and dangerous is happening in our skies.
Fighters have violated Estonia's airspace.
Solo en las últimas 2 semanas,
In just the last 2 weeks, Russian MiGs violated Estonian airspace, and drones flew over critical sites in Romania, Belgium, Poland, Denmark, and Germany. Civilian flights were grounded, the air defenses of neighboring countries were activated, and all necessary measures were taken to ensure the safety of our citizens.
Para garantizar la seguridad de nuestros ciudadanos. Señoras y señores, no se equivoquen.
Ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake.
A worrisome pattern of growing threats.
Esto es parte de un patrón creciente.
This is part of a growing pattern of direct threats. Across our union, undersea cables were cut.
Cables submarinos fueron cortados.
Airports and logistic hubs paralyzed by
Airports and logistics hubs were paralyzed by cyber attacks.
elections targeted by malign influence campaign.
Y elecciones fueron
And the elections were manipulated by smear campaigns on social media.
En las redes.
These incidents are calculated to
These incidents are designed to blend into the realm of the deniable.
This is not random harassment.
This isn't random harassment, it's targeted harassment.
It's a coherent
It's consistent.
and escalating campaign to unsettle our citizens.
It's a coherent campaign to destabilize our citizens,
Para desestabilizar a nuestros ciudadanos,
Test our resolve, divide our union,
dividir a la Unión, testear nuestra resolución,
divide the union, test our resolve,
and it is time to call it by its name.
y debilitar nuestro apoyo a Ucrania. Y es hora
and to weaken our support for Ukraine. It's time to call all this by its name. This is a hybrid war. Here's the declaration of war, Fernando. Europe at war.
la declaración de guerra, Fernando.
Sí, sí, sí.
Europa en guerra, un poquito más.
And we have to take it very seriously.
A little more. We have to take this very seriously. To those who doubt, look at what's happening.
Lo que está sucediendo.
One incident may be a mistake. 2 incidents are coincidence.
Un incidente,
An incident can be a mistake. 2 incidents are a coincidence.
coincidencia,
But 3, 5, 10. This is a deliberate
pero 3, 5, 20, esto es
But 3, 5, 20. This is a targeted and deliberate campaign in a grey zone against Europe. And Europe must respond. We must investigate every incident.
investigate every incident.
debemos
We
investigar,
We must investigate every incident.
Responsibility.
y no
And we should not be ashamed to assign responsibility.
responsabilidades.
Because every square centimeter of our territory must be protected and safe.
Porque cada centímetro de nuestro territorio debe ser protegido y debe estar.
Because every inch of our territory must be protected and kept safe.
Miembros honorables,
Honourable members, Russia wants to deepen the division.
la división.
We have to answer with unity.
Nosotros tenemos que responder con unidad.
It was
We have to respond with unity.
escorted Russian jets from Estonian skies.
Fueron pilotos italianos los que
It was Italian pilots who escorted the jets, the Russian fighters, back to their territory. Ukrainian experts are sharing their knowledge of the battlefield with us to counter Russian drone operations.
de frente de batalla para contrarrestar las acciones de los drones rusos.
This is solidarity in action.
Esto es solidaridad en acción.
But we must not
This is solidarity in action. But we must not only react, we must deter. Because if we hesitate, the grey zone will only expand.
And today that means having the capacity to
La misión fundadora de la Unión Europea es preservar
The founding mission of the European Union is to preserve peace. And today that means responding to aggression and provocation. Europe must equip itself with a strategic capacity to confront them.
una capacidad estratégica para responder.
one that is ready to address the change
A capability ready to respond to the changing nature of war. We must develop and maintain it together. And we must be able to respond in real time. We must do it together and do it in real time.
in the history of the Union.
Bueno, el trabajo, hemos comenzado este trabajo, estamos viendo el mayor gasto militar.
Well, the work. We've started this work. We're seeing the largest military spending in the history of the European Union already underway. The rearmament agenda will mobilize 800 billion euros in weapons by 2030. Now, we need a very coordinated and well thought out pan-European plan, coordinated with NATO as well, on how to move forward from here. And this is the core of our proposal, the one we presented in Copenhagen last week. Fernando, to take a break and not present everything at once, let's pause and start the analysis. I'm here, shivering. Your perspective on this, please.
Tu perspectiva sobre esto, por favor.
Bueno, a ver, primero, esto no es casualidad, es decir, que lo que vimos.
Well, let's see. First of all, this isn't a coincidence. I mean, what we saw last week and the week before with Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, also saying that we're at war and all that, these things and more things that have happened are clearly part of a coordinated action in which all the European leaders, more or less, are going to start saying, oh, this happened to me, oh, we're at war, oh, I don't know what, the Russians are attacking us. Well, this is already, I mean, it's nothing new. As for the idea that we're in a hybrid war, I have to agree with that. The problem is that they in the United States started the hybrid war. But yes, indeed, we are in a hybrid war. I'd go even further. We're in a hybrid world war. Anyway, then of course, all the nonsense about drones, here and there, without any proof. Not a single drone has shown up, and the ones that have are laughable, like those in Poland, over chicken coops and things like that. So of course, cyber attacks, but he doesn't provide evidence, doesn't show proof, doesn't say anything, right? Well, the so-called incident with the Russian MiG-31s, and even if it were true, it would be something trivial. I mean, something that happens all the time, especially in an area like the Gulf of Finland, heading toward, let's not forget, Estonia, which forms the Gulf of Finland together with Finland to the north and Estonia to the south. In other words, it would be something where, moreover, international airspace overlaps with national airspaces. So, well, as I said, if that were the case, it would be a minor issue. With routes, moreover, that they knew perfectly well, these kinds of routes to avoid incidents, they say, especially given the situation we're in. But really, all of this is nonsense. It doesn't matter. It's all made up. Well, nothing. I mean, underneath there's nothing. Underneath there's just, well, smoke. And then, of course, they come along blatantly lying, like Mrs. von der Leyen does, and telling us, for example, that, well, aside from the drones and all that, it makes me laugh that we're collaborating with the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians with us. We're so useless that, since we don't know how to make drones, they have to come and teach us. I mean, this lady is telling us that the European forces are going to be able to eliminate the Russian threat by carrying out all kinds of military projections and manufacturing who knows what weapons, and they don't even know how to make drones. The Ukrainians who are at war with the Russians have to come, in this case, to Denmark to teach the Danes and the rest of the Europeans how to make one of those cheap little quadcopters. But seriously, we're the ones who are going to defeat the Russians. This is delusional. I mean, it's something absolutely senseless. Well, I mean senseless from the standpoint of reality. What these people want is to drag us into a confrontation with Russia, which they're obviously going to lose, and from there they'll try to use. Well, the first part of the process is, we keep doing all this. Notice that here Mrs. von der Leyen is speaking to us as if this were NATO. That is, the European Union's defense capabilities are very limited, and this lady is already more or less organizing the European army. But you can't do that. They're violating the treaties. You are not, nor do you have the authority. In any case, those would be decisions for the Council. What we're seeing is that the European Council, that is, where the presidents and prime ministers of the member states of the European Union meet, has been emptied of substance in favor of a European Commission and a Commission president who already acts as the president of Europe, plain and simple, and who claims the authority to, let's say, well, legislate, that is, the European Parliament would legislate, but it doesn't matter, and to carry out actions in the field of defense. But not only in the field of arms manufacturing, which is highly debatable, but almost in the field of war. Because wars are no longer declared, but if it weren't for that, this lady would be, or is, the one in charge of declaring war on Russia, when the European Union cannot do that. That is to say, it would have to be its member states, on their own, or within NATO. But since the Americans are in NATO and they say there's nothing to it, that they don't want to have anything to do with this, in the end what we're also seeing is how NATO is dissolving. Beyond the issue of US funding, that is, that they use NATO to sell their weapons, and the foolish Europeans buy them at exorbitant prices, beyond that, NATO has practically turned into a US sales system and little else. They, the European Union, are taking on NATO's role, forming a kind of European NATO. It's something, well, that's already there, meaning they've already done it, we've already achieved it. We now have a sort of European NATO. Laughable. But in the end, a European NATO which is called the European Union. And these people are going to lead us into a confrontation with the Russians, which they're going to lose. But along the way, they're going to build a totalitarian state, which is what they want. Totalitarian United States of Europe. And taking advantage of the idea that the Russians are invading us and adopting European emergency measures in response to the Russian attack, well, later, when they lose, they'll use every means they have to justify that defeat as the result of betrayal. The betrayal of those who are against democracy, of the far-right parties, of whatever, basically of everything outside the dominant thinking of the European Union, to impose totalitarian measures at the European level, which ultimately means the definitive ruin of what we know as liberal democracy.
Fernando, this lady, not elected by anyone, first starred in the incident. Well, I shouldn't call it an incident. She staged the performance, the scandal of the supposed interruption of her plane's GPS signal in Bulgaria, if I remember correctly, right? Her plane descended without any problem, and she immediately started shouting that the Russians had interfered with her plane's GPS, something denied by the Bulgarian authorities, who didn't even open an investigation about it. And the plane descended using other positioning systems, according to her, a paper map, something that ridiculous. But anyway, same thing. So she started this with the first provocation. She was at the center of that scandal. After that, she now declares the hybrid war, and in addition, presents on one hand the $800 billion rearmament plan, the action plan shown in Copenhagen last week, with the request for an additional $140 billion for Ukraine and Ukraine's entry into the European Union. And to top it all off, they make a call to action. Enough talk. We're making a call to action for a plan in line with NATO. This lady, among all those responsible for the escalation with Russia, Fernando, is at the top of the list, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
That's what the door is for. I mean, exactly. But also, notice that the woman tells us this and talks several times about the gray zone. What is this gray zone? Well, there's war as such, peace, and then something in between that's neither war nor peace. Or it's a war in which no obvious evident attacks are made, but things are happening, like cyber attacks, for example, that can be attributed to anyone, meaning a group of cyber criminals, etc., in the gray zone. But this already reveals something to us, what they want to do. In other words, it's not what she denounces the Russians for doing. No. It's what they want to do. Operate in the gray zone in such a way that they keep attacking the Russians, but with a certain ambiguity, denying that they're really the ones attacking the Russians, and claiming instead that they're simply taking defensive actions and helping Ukraine. They're the ones who are in the gray zone right now, that is, in a very silly, poorly constructed gray zone, not the Russians. What they're saying is, stop fooling around, don't keep going down this path, and let's see, at some point, we'll talk about it more calmly later, Putin won't be able to stay moderate. He's under more pressure every day. The Russians are getting more and more tense every day, both the population and the political and economic establishment. They're getting more and more fed up with this war in Ukraine, which, let's not forget, is a war of NATO against Russia in Ukraine, and with the lukewarm military measures the Kremlin is applying. That is to say, we'll talk about it later, but the moment when they get completely fed up is getting closer. And if they do get completely fed up, the Europeans are going to run away, bolt, really. Because one of the traits all these politicians have, wonderful, right, is that they're absolute cowards. As we said before, they're in it to get rich and then to push anti-Russian policies, still clinging to the airs they had back when they were empires and so on, right? And well, they justify the economic disaster they've plunged Europe into with the ghost of the Russians. The Russians are coming. From there, these people, as I said, are going to keep sinking Europe. Europe has no future. That's it. There's no replacement. Unfortunately, if we get rid of the ones who are in power now, we'll just put in others who are just as idiotic, just as globalist, just as useless, just as corrupt. That's the general state of the European political class, unfortunately, with a few exceptions here and there. And that's what we've got, which means there's no salvation for us. I'll say it. This is like the Titanic. It's sinking. And the politicians are telling us the story that no, everything's fine. Where are the icebergs? There aren't any. Didn't the Titanic hit an iceberg? No way, no way. We're sailing along calmly and all that. Hey, but aren't there lifeboats going out with people fleeing and so on? No, that's just people going out for a little ride in the boats to enjoy the scenery and see the marine life. Well, this is what they're telling us. They want to make some crazy movies to hide what they're really doing, which is destroying Europe, but to levels we can't even imagine. And well, they're going to ruin it in this war, and we'll see if, unfortunately, and everything seems to point that way, we end up in a war with Russia. And well, the thing is, these people aren't capable of getting the Americans involved. So it's going to be a laughable war. In the sense that as soon as the Russians do 3 or 4 things, these guys will surrender in 2 days, because they're a bunch of cowards. That's another thing. They're not willing to sacrifice their privileges and their comfortable lives just to have a missile fall on them, which would be one way to deter them. But anyway.
Yes, now Fernando, wars generally have one characteristic. We can determine how and when they begin, but not how they end. And the speculation that the Russians would quickly determine the outcome of the war. Yes, logically that makes sense. But once a war between Europe and Russia begins, anything is possible, Fernando.
They would justify it. It's very Orwellian. They would justify the war, and what they would want, whether they achieve it or not, would be to remain in a permanent state of war with the Russians, without things escalating further, or in that gray zone, so they can carry out their manipulations in Europe, to build those totalitarian United States of Europe, to finish eliminating what remains of democracies in the liberal democracies and in the member states of the European Union, to completely destroy the sovereignty of those member states and justify it all by hiding the economic disaster, which would be explained by the claim that the Russians are attacking us. No. The reason Europe is an economic disaster isn't our fault. It's not because of our management. It's because of the Russians, who are there and have prevented us from carrying out the brilliant management we were going to do. This is what they want: a permanent war, or a permanent state of war, as now, in the gray zone, helping Ukraine.
I'm shocked by how fast the narrative has changed, how fast these people's discourse has shifted. Because not long ago, just 2 years back, they started with the spiel about sending defensive weapons for Ukraine's defense. From there came the howitzers, then the missile launchers, then the tanks, right? And always the same narrative, the Russians getting worse and worse. The threat not only to Ukraine, but to European democracy. Even though, until quite recently, this wasn't our war. We were only taking part in defense of international law. But from tanks to planes, from planes to long-range missiles, now the discussion about Tomahawk missiles, and now this is directly our war. It was said outright a few days ago last week by Donald Tusk, the Polish president or prime minister, and now Ursula von der Leyen with the declaration of hybrid war and the call to action. The room for escalation without direct confrontation is getting smaller and smaller, Fernando, leaving less space for Putin not to react.
Sure, but I think this basically comes down to desperation, and to the fact that they're seeing that Ukraine won't make it through this winter. That is, it won't make it through this winter because the Russians finally, it's something that, well, is hard to understand, but finally, since this summer, they've started systematically destroying day after day Ukraine's energy infrastructure. And this winter, it's not just that people might freeze to death, though that too. It's simply that they won't be able to function in any way, not even militarily. They're no longer just destroying repeaters or electrical substations, they're directly attacking and destroying power plants. The only ones not attacking for the moment are the nuclear plants. Although a nuclear plant can be shut down without attacking it, that's another story. They're also taking down the power plants, almost all the gas systems, and everything related to oil and indeed the oil refineries. In other words, they're de-energizing the country, and there are more and more blackouts. Then, after some time, they can patch things up a bit, and well, the media smooths it over. But this is going to reach a point where it will be unsustainable. That is, the whole system will collapse and won't be able to hold up. And that will mean a major blackout, not only of electric power, but also of fuel capacity. Let's not forget that most of the logistical transport up to the vicinity, not to the front line itself, but to certain areas near the front, where other means are already used, is done by rail, through trains. And there are two types of trains, electric and diesel locomotives. The electric ones, as their name suggests, stop working as soon as the power is cut off. And in fact, they haven't been operating for quite some time. Most of the locomotives being used are diesel. And what are the Russians doing now? Attacking the diesel engines. In addition to that, they're also attacking the oil refineries, which are responsible for producing diesel. So that really means they won't have diesel for the locomotives or for the trucks or anything like that. It's over. I mean, this has just made Mrs. von der Leyen and company's hair stand on end, because they're seeing that the whole thing about using Ukraine to justify spending and a bunch of other things is coming to an end. They're being defeated, they're getting through the winter, and right now they're escalating quickly, saying we're at war and so on, making up drones and whatever else they need. And what we'll see in the 2 odd months left until the end of the year will be a continuous invention of things, of phantom Russian aggressions, and an increase in speeches and actions, as von der Leyen says, by the European Union to confront the Russians.
para enfrentarse a los rusos. ¿Hasta dónde van a aguantar los rusos? Pues eso es muy difícil de saber.
How long are the Russians going to hold out? Well, that's very hard to know, because they have a lot of endurance. But of course, what we're going to see is that more and more people are going to poke the Russians in the eye. And from there, we can speculate and talk about how far they might go. The Russians do have certain limits, even though they're especially tolerant and have taken this war in Ukraine as a very particular kind of war. Later, with the tomahawks, we'll talk about that. But anyway, the time will come when the extremely moderate Putin, I've never seen anything like it, will have to give in to the tougher positions.
Las posiciones más duras.
And when it has to take tougher positions, then we'll find out what it really means to play hardball. I found out a long time ago because I ended up bald. But it's going to be terrible. I mean, these people don't care what happens to Europeans. We must not forget that the European elite we have is an elite that doesn't work for European citizens. It works for itself and for its political class, which lives quite comfortably as a Euro bureaucracy, elected or not. That is, living off the setup called the European Union. So well, these people are already forming a class with common interests and, well, they're willing to sacrifice Europe rather than sacrifice their own interests. We need to be absolutely clear about that. And they're going to do it, you know? I mean, we're heading toward war with the Russians. No one should doubt that. It could be a very short war, I mean, because I'm speculating here. They go launch 3 missiles. One hits Germany, another France, and the other Great Britain. And those guys, to put it bluntly, get scared to death. And that's the end of the nonsense. But, well, that's how it is. Anyway, this is what we're seeing. We've already heard these speeches from Mrs. von der Leyen.
Absolutely delusional, as proof that this lady doesn't appear alone, but is accompanied by the heads of state of European countries. Here's Donald Tusk as well. This isn't from today, but from yesterday, at a press conference, when he was asked about Poland's position regarding the explosion of the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines, and in particular about Poland's refusal to extradite the alleged perpetrator, a Ukrainian citizen protected and granted asylum in Poland, supposedly responsible for the pipeline explosions. And he's going to respond with this outrageous statement. Donald Tusk.
I can't talk about the details for obvious reasons, but I want you to know.
I can't comment on the case of this man who is protected and granted asylum by Poland. I can't give details for obvious reasons, but I want to tell you something regarding the Ukrainian citizen accused by the German prosecutor. To take part in the bombing of the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines. On this topic, months ago I presented very clear information to the then German Chancellor, obviously Scholz, the previous one. Thank you. I also presented information to President Zelensky, whom I informed about Poland's position. From our point of view, the only people who should be punished and remain silent on the issue of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline are those who decided on its construction.
Problemem Europy, problemem Ukrainy, problemem Litwy, Polski.
The problem
The problem in Ukraine, the problem in Poland, the problem in Europe, in Lithuania. For us, the problem is not that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was blown up, was destroyed. For us, the problem is that the pipeline was built.
Nie mogę mówić o szczegółach.
Hasta ahí.
Nord Stream 2, tylko że go zbudowano.
Hasta ahí.
That's it. Did you hear that, Fernando?
Claro, esto es como si yo cometo un asesinato.
Of course. This is like if I committed a murder and then the guilty one was the murdered person, not the murderer. It's insane. This is the level of madness we've reached. No, the blame lies with those who built it. That is, the Russians and the German administration at the time, which was Schroeder.
Careful, it wasn't just anyone. It was Schroeder. The first with Schroeder, the second with Merkel.
Anyway, the one who started the whole thing and later became head of the consortium for many years, the one who did all this, was a man very close, let's say, to Russian policies, to put it one way. But of course, go ahead and throw the former chancellor and Merkel in jail, and then, if you can, throw in the Russians too. It's absurd. They try to justify the destruction of a pipeline in which several European companies had a stake. Not just German ones, Austrian ones too, for example. In other words, they justify it by saying, no, the problem isn't that someone destroyed the gas pipelines of sovereign countries like Germany, Russia, and so on. What nonsense. No, that's not the problem. The problem is having built it. The problem isn't that I killed someone. The problem is that the person was born. Indeed, the problem is that they were born. If they hadn't been born, I wouldn't have had to kill them. That's the logic. Anyway, it's delusional. This is something for a psychiatrist. But, well, that's the justification. When you've run out of reason and arguments, you have to resort to this kind of statement. Well, Donald Tusk has been covering himself in glory these past few weeks. And it seems that right now, he's von der Leyen's battering ram for saying nonsense against the Russians.
Yes. Now, Fernando, the Prime Minister of one of the main European countries, one of the leaders or shapers of Europe's foreign policy, openly validates it. Because until recently, you'll remember, Poland was portrayed within the European Union as a case of demagoguery, of democratic decline caused by the populist government's demagoguery, until the war began. And those same demagogic, far-right populist governments started leading the anti-Russian movement. Suddenly, they appeared as the leaders of the European Union and the ideologues of its foreign policy. That's Poland's turnaround, from the bad guy to the good guy. Now, in that context, is he validating an act of terrorism? And what is, in some way, the underlying premise of this line of thought? Russia represents evil on Earth. Russia represents all evils. Therefore, anyone who establishes relations with Russia, even if they are energy-related, economic, or peaceful, commits a mortal sin and consequently must disappear. This is the same logic behind genocides. The problem is not the genocide against Armenians, Jews, homosexuals, or Martians. The problem is that those beings are not seen as people, and the problem is their very existence. This is a very dangerous discourse, Fernando, and it's being said as if it were nothing.
Remember, you also did an extraordinary program, which I recommend people watch, even though it was about a year and a bit ago, I think. But anyway, yes, at least that. Explaining perfectly the famous Borel's garden. Where did Borel's garden come from? It wasn't originally Borel's. On top of that, it was copied. I mean, there's a program that explains very well the European superorganism that goes beyond right and left, understanding left as what we have here as the left, meaning that those who claim to be left-wing, well, nothing, really. But anyway, it's explained very well there, and the thing is, all of them are supremacists. They're racists. In other words, they believe they're superior. And since they see themselves as superior to the rest, well, they just accept it and say, well, hey, if we have to kill Africans, we kill Africans. If we have to kill Latin Americans, we kill Latin Americans. If we have to kill Asians, we kill Asians, no problem. If we're inferior, we're not white. That's exactly it. They're not white, and above all, not Western white. Because even within that group there are differences. Not all of them are equally white. That is, the Anglo-Saxons and the Germanic peoples are whiter than anyone else. And then there's the rest of us, who are just, well, something else entirely. But this is a very old discourse, 19th century at least, or even earlier. Because if we look at how British slaveholders justified it in the 18th century, if I remember correctly, there were about 12 million Africans, black people, who were enslaved and taken to the Americas throughout the entire period of slavery, from the beginning of modern slavery in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries until it gradually dissolved. In other words, it's the same mentality. The thing is, until now this was covered up. It wasn't said openly. Just to mention it as an anecdote, in the United States in 2008, and I had the chance to talk with many people in black neighborhoods and so on, to live in their homes for a few days and such, and talking with them, they told me, in 2008, when some of those attitudes were still preserved in certain ways. They used to tell me, no, but let's see, the issue of racism is the same, exactly the same as always. The thing is that now it's politically incorrect to go around saying that black people are inferior. But that's what has changed. They don't say it anymore, and they go around saying that black people are great and all that, and wonderful, but deep down in practice, it's still the same. Well, that happens. What's happening now, the new thing, is that now they actually say it. I mean, not in the case of black people in general, but in the case of African Americans in the United States, because they're used by the Democrats and so on. So, well, the Republicans, even though they think it, the Democrats do too, but they use them. That is, the Republicans can't say anything because they'd lose a core group of votes there, and so on, and for strategic reasons. So, well, they also have to say they're wonderful. But deep down, we've already seen it. I mean, and this is the delusion of these people. These people are still supremacists. And so, well, they justify the unjustifiable, because deep down what underlies this kind of reasoning is that since I'm superior, then, well, I can allow myself to say that Russia is guilty. Because if I say Russia is guilty, after all, they are guilty, even if they hadn't done it. Since, as Slavs and inferiors, they're guilty just for existing. That is, and if they didn't do this, then they've done something else.
This said by other Slavs, by Poles.
It's also a level of delusion, isn't it? Of course, but these people consider themselves, well, superior Slavs. I mean, it should also be said, and this is important, the current Prime Minister, this man Donald Tusk, a globalist and one of the biggest, is part of this interchangeable European political class. That is, this man was Prime Minister of Poland, then stopped being Prime Minister, held a high position in the European Union, I don't remember which one, but one of the top ones for a while. And then, after his term ended, he ran again recently, won the parliamentary elections in Poland, and is now Prime Minister. Watch out for a man, I can't remember his name, who isn't from this party. He must be from a more nationalist, more right-wing one, with a president who says, hold on to your seat just in case, because what I'm about to say is pretty wild, that he's worse than Malay. Because Malay, after all, if he communicates with his dog, there's been a prior relationship, and he does it through a medium, not directly. This guy has declared that he talks with General Piłsudski. Just like that, really, that he talks with General Piłsudski from the interwar period, meaning without any medium. Just like that, as if you and I were talking. And he says they discuss things, and Piłsudski gives him advice. Now how is that even possible? This is the man we saw, I don't know if it's that stuff he smokes, that weird mix of tobacco or whatever, those little pouches they brought him. I mean, what are they? Tobacco? Either that tobacco stuff especially affects neurons, I don't know. Or well, let's see what this is, but those little bags surely have something to do with it, because for someone to say these things, they must be completely out of their mind. Anyway, next time I'll tell you about my conversations with Franco, whom I also ask things from time to time, and I've already spoken with El Cid Campeador. But hey, if I said that, everyone would say this man is crazy. Yet a guy who's president of Poland says it. He's still president of Poland, and they don't remove him from office for being crazy. I mean, if it were any of you, straight to a psychiatric hospital, they'd run some tests and lock you up in an asylum. Well, this is the world we live in.
Here's the reaction from the Prime Minister. Sorry, the Hungarian Foreign Minister. At least in this case, a voice of reason. According to Donald Tusk, blowing up a gas pipeline is acceptable. It's shocking, because it makes you wonder what else could be blown up and still be considered forgivable or even praiseworthy. One thing is clear. We don't want a Europe where prime ministers defend terrorists. This is his response to Donald Trump's post on X, basically making the same claim. The problem with Nord Stream 2 isn't that it was blown up. The problem is that it was built.
Well, the problem with the Russians, as we were saying before, isn't whether they wage wars or not. It's that they exist.
Of course, yes, exactly. That's the logic.
That's the logic, of course.
Fernando, my dear, regarding the provocations and the escalations toward war on the other side of the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, Donald Trump is supposedly deliberating on whether or not to deliver the Tomahawk missiles requested by Zelensky. This is the question, and now the answer for now Gray, up to this moment, here.
To Ukraine or sell them to NATO and let them sell them to Ukraine. Yeah, I've sort of made a decision.
Yes, I think I want to know what they're doing with them. Where are they sending them? I think I have to ask that question.
Where are they sending them? I guess I'd have to ask that question.
Bueno, ¿para qué podrán querer? Sí, ¿para qué?
Well, what could they want the missiles for? In the context of a war, their general use is launching them, not as toothpicks, usually.
Of course not. Here he's completely dodging the issue, saying, well, yes, sure, I'll think about it, and all that. What do they want the missiles for? Obviously, a rhetorical, ironic, and sarcastic question. What do they want the missiles for? Well, we'll see. That is, in the logic, and let's not forget that if he were to give them something, he wouldn't give it to the Ukrainians. He'd give it to the Europeans, who buy it from the Americans, and then the Europeans would be the ones responsible for giving it to the Ukrainians, or to the Martians. In the case of the Tomahawks, the matter is more complex and different, because here we're already dealing with a serious problem, and Putin has already said this. I mean, let's see. Once again, the same thing. We already saw it in the case of long-range missiles. Well, these really are long-range, in quotes. The others weren't, but anyway. Let's see, the Tomahawk missiles, depending on the variant, have a range of around 1,400 or 1,500 kilometers at minimum, and up to 2,500 at most. As I said, it depends on the age, the variant, and so on. We're no longer talking about the Storm Shadow or Scalp, limited to 300 kilometers, or the ATAC MS, those that were under 500 kilometers. The Americans deliberately limited them. That is, they can be launched, as Mr. Souls told us. But for these, national crews were required. The Ukrainians didn't launch them because they don't know how, because it's very complex. It's not just pressing a button and that's it, you know? So imagine the Tomahawks. The Tomahawks are much more complex. It's a technology that, although very old, is still relevant. Their entry into service, if I remember correctly, as operational missiles was in 1983. Designed and built in the 70s, they entered service in 83. So what happened? Even though they've been modernized and all, as Putin said, they're a bit obsolete. He didn't mean it like, well, they're not bad, but they only go so far. Good for pounding Afghans and that sort of thing, sure. But with the Russians, it would be a different story. Of course, this is the problem with range. These really are long-range missiles. It's not that they would attack Moscow, but they could strike deep, almost as far as the Urals. We're talking about something else entirely. We're no longer in the Taurus debate, which reach, at most, 800 kilometers. And that their reach can also be limited, well, like everyone else's. But, of course, and also, as I keep saying, Putin, in one of those interviews they did with him, says, no, but let's see, this has a problem. I don't know if it was an interview or a speech he was giving, but indeed this would mean that there would be American soldiers firing the Tomahawks, because no one else can do it but them. And of course, there's no doubt about it. If we have a Tomahawk launched from Ukrainian territory and it hits Russia or anywhere else, then it was the Americans. That's an act of war. At that point, we'd have no choice but to go to war. No matter how much restraint we want to show, there's no way around it. And he already said it, this at best would end or completely break our relations with the United States.
Well, here's the thing. On one hand, The Telegraph, a British anti-Russian publication. Ukraine is preparing for the delivery of Tomahawk missiles that it can't fire. Basically, that's your argument, Fernando. Kiev's security chief says the rockets will be used as leverage to gradually increase pressure on Putin. Well, they won't be able to use these without the direct involvement of the Americans. And not just in terms of the decision, but also in terms of the operation. Much more so than in the case of the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, which Fernando also mentioned. And here's Putin's response. In this case, Putin is quite clear. This is his response. If you can help me with this, there, now we're good.
Ahora sí.
The President of the United States. But there were also issues related to the discussion about problems in the delivery of new weapon systems, including high-precision firing systems, the Tomahawks, and so on. I have already said that this will lead to the destruction of our relations, or in any case, of the positive trends that had been developing in them.
Yes, but clearly, for Putin, a very diplomatic guy, this will break the trend of rapprochement that was developing with Russia. Words directed straight at Trump.
Of course, this is nonsense. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen, although in the world we live in, anything is possible, especially with the Trump administration. But anyway, because this would indeed break with Trump's strategy. Let's not forget what Trump has done about this, ultimately, since he became president, regarding the war in Ukraine, saying he's going to talk to Putin, then calling him, then not calling him, then getting the Ukrainians and Russians to sit down together in Istanbul to talk, and they've done it 3 times, then meeting with Putin in Alaska, then talking about who knows what, then sending Marco Rubio to talk to Lavrov. Wasting time. Basically, what is he still doing? Now, whether to send the Tomahawks or not, whether we'll see later. Careful, that request has already been rejected several times by Trump himself, because Zelensky has been asking for it for a long time. Every time he meets with the Americans, he asks for them. Another matter is whether they're willing to give them to him. Anyway, Maria Laperdiz has the media keeping a close eye on all this, and he knows that if he does that, well, even Trump would notice. It's a war with the Russians. And the Russian factions, what we were talking about earlier, Putin, who is supposedly the most moderate person in the world, also understands that the war in Ukraine is a very particular kind of war because it's almost a civil war, and he doesn't want to destroy Ukraine for many reasons, among them the fact that he's going to keep part of it. Anyway, aside from that, he's showing extraordinary restraint. He won't have it with the others. I mean, if he ends up going to war with the Europeans, the Americans, openly, then he'll find out, because then he really won't be so considerate. But the thing is, almost the entire establishment, as I said, or the vast majority of the Russian establishment, is telling him that, and the population too, that he's being too soft in the war in Ukraine. And mind you, the Russians have more than enough weaponry to be much tougher. And look, for example, I had the answer right here. They asked a Russian man named Andrei Kartapolov, who is the head of the Defense Committee of the Russian Parliament, and who should have something to say about this. And the man's response when asked about the tomahawks, about what would happen, was the following. Our response will be, if they deliver them, tough, ambiguous, measured, and asymmetric. We will find ways to harm those who cause us problems. This has some weight to it. He says tough, and that part is clear. It's not going to be a soft-handed move. Not an Orsk launched against a factory in Dnipro, a weapons factory. No, it's going to be something forceful. Obviously, he doesn't say what. Ambiguous. Now that's an interesting thing.
Esto es una cosa interesante. Ambiguo, es decir, de difícil interpretación.
Ambiguous, meaning difficult to interpret, not going to be clear. Measured, meaning they're not a bunch of lunatics who are going to escalate like the Europeans are doing and end up in a nuclear war. And then asymmetric. Careful, because asymmetric here means, from my point of view, the following. Something is symmetric when I respond in kind. That is, if they launch, for example, a classic example, if the Americans place Tomahawk missiles in Ukraine and the Americans fire them, then the Russians place Kh-101 missiles, for instance, whatever kind, in Cuba and launch them. That would be symmetric, just so we understand each other. Something like that, right?
Algo así, ¿no? Asimétrico puede ser asimétrico por abajo o por arriba.
Asymmetric can mean from below or from above. That is, I can do something asymmetric, a smaller scale attack, less significant, or an asymmetric attack, because what I do is much more powerful, tougher, as he points out, the head of the Russian Parliament's Defense Committee. Tougher. And with that, I try to warn the Americans not to continue down that path. That's why it's asymmetric. In other words, right now in Russia, there is increasing pressure because there's a problem, and this one is indeed very serious. The problem is the following, and it's that, and here I am critical of Putin. Putin has shown extreme prudence and moderation, what is usually called strategic prudence. They've done everything to him. Well, the escalations you mentioned, from the Europeans and the Americans, boom, boom, with more and more weaponry and greater capacity and so on. And he held out until the Americans came in with those ATAC-MS and such, and they launched the Storm Shadows in November of last year. Well, it seems they've learned. They keep doing the same thing. The problem is that they keep crossing red lines, or supposed red lines, and the Russians do nothing. The thing is, since these idiots interpret prudence and moderation as weakness, they keep going. That is, no, the Russians are bluffing. That's kind of how these people think. The Russians are bluffing. And beyond pounding the Ukrainians, we don't care if they launch storm shadows at the Ukrainians. What difference does it make to us? That is to say, if they go through it so they can be killed. That's the logic of these people. Well, nothing happens. We can keep escalating. Of course, the problem with that is, as I said, that the Russians at a certain point, in order to avoid escalation, might provoke escalation. Let me explain. If the others interpret your moderation as weakness, they will escalate to such an extent that by the time you respond, the quasi-nuclear war will be impossible to stop. Because they will have gone so far, taking advantage of your prudence, that they will become so reckless, they'll make a false move, and then the Russians will have to respond with tremendous force. And that's the big problem. That is to say, you have to measure things. On one hand, be cautious, but on the other, give firm and tough responses to prevent the escalation from continuing. Because if not, these people will lead us into a nuclear war. I mean, if it were up to these irresponsible ones, since they have no common sense, they just keep provoking. Look at what we've seen with von der Leyen. No, we're in a hybrid war. We have to act. We're gonna do, which she's also been saying around. Yes, lately she's been talking about this so-called drone or anti-drone wall, and it's all nonsense. But anyway, the next bright idea might be that we start sending European drones, but from Europe, to attack the Russians. Let's see what happens, or whatever else they come up with. And there's going to come a time when the Russians will say, how far have we gone? And the answer won't be an Oreshnik anymore. It'll be what Karaganov, or similar people like Trenin and others are saying. In other words, it'll be a tactical nuclear missile in Berlin, another in London, and another in Paris. And that'll be the end of the nonsense. I mean, do we really think the Americans are going to come here to save our skins, to face a nuclear confrontation with the Russians over a war that will destroy them too? No, they're going to leave us hanging. I mean, because nobody believes in the nuclear umbrella anymore. Maybe it worked during the Cold War, but now it definitely doesn't work on the American side. That's the danger, that the Europeans and Zelensky, with European support. And what's next? Because he's already asked for it many times. Nuclear missiles. In fact, he asked for them even before the war. So, what's going to be the next foolish idea? It's worrying for that reason, because it's also something that won't change the course of the war. The Russians have accepted something that hasn't been seen in this war. Basically, what is it? Being superior, using boxing terms. Imagine a heavyweight against a featherweight.
Imaginemos un peso pesado con un peso pluma.
I mean, a heavyweight would take out a featherweight with 2 slaps. So the heavyweight, for different reasons, we can get into them later if you want, though they're quite long, decides that instead of landing a blow and knocking the other out in the first round, he's going to engage in an exchange of punches. That's basically what's happening now. They're taking down Ukraine's energy system, destroying not only substations but also similar infrastructure, just like they did at the beginning, in the fall of 2022, during Surovikin's time. Now they're going directly after, not only that, which they're still doing, but also thermal power plants, all kinds of power stations, except for the nuclear ones, which they haven't touched so far, though they could be shut down without being hit. And they're taking out oil refineries and also gas storage facilities and so on. In other words, they're going to leave them in winter without gas, without anything, without energy. And what does that mean? Because it's not just that the population will be left without energy, and that would imply, because of what we said before, the panic of Europeans, another new wave of immigration. Because if you're left without electricity, even if it were summer, you'd be miserable. So most of the population, or a good part of it, especially those who could, would run away. A new migratory wave toward Europe and more problems. But no, the worst thing about the system is that, and we're seeing it now when we see the attacks on the stations like you showed the other day and so on, is that the trains, meaning the electric locomotives, no longer work. Because without electricity, they have serious problems. In fact, the Ukrainians use them as little as possible, but they're no longer reliable. And let's not forget that in the logistics of sending everything they're delivering to the troops on the front lines, most of the route is basically done by train, because it's the most economical way, where you can load a bunch of freight cars and so on. Well, fine. Now, as I said, without the electric locomotives, what's left? The diesel ones, which are the most commonly used. But what are the Russians doing? Attacking the diesel locomotives, as we saw the other day, and attacking the gasoline and diesel depots and the refineries. So you're going to run out of diesel too, on top of running out of machines. In other words, from that point on, the Europeans' desperation will lead them to do something else crazy. We'll see what ideas they come up with and how the Russians respond. And we're not going to see this 20 years from now. We're going to see it this winter, before the year is over.
Yes. Now, Fernando, tactical nuclear bombs, or tactical nuclear weapons, with lower destructive power than strategic ones, obviously still have enormous destructive capacity. The larger ones, Putin mentioned this the other day at the Valdai discussion forum, if I remember correctly. Well, at Valdai, yes, roughly speaking, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs had between 15 and 20 kilotons. Current tactical nuclear weapons, in some cases, reach up to 100 kilotons. So, tremendous, tremendous. Such a scenario would also create the possibility of an even greater escalation towards strategic nuclear weapons. An impressive thing.
It's just absurd. I mean, because if they were to deploy the Tomahawks, the Russians would have no choice. Let's put it in extremely moderate terms, because they've also said, well, they've been saying this for a long time, that they can attack, indirectly. That is, you don't have to launch an attack against Ukraine or directly against Europe or the United States. You can just send that more powerful weaponry to the Houthis in Yemen so they can hit the US fleet that's operating there. That's one way of doing it, right? Or to the Venezuelans.
To Venezuela or to Iran, indeed.
Or to Iran. In fact, they're already doing it with Iran. Let's not forget that. Practically every day, Russian military planes arrive carrying military cargo, and they're using Antonov 1-4s, not Ilyushin 76s, which are larger and can transport aircraft with folded wings and so on. Then they have to assemble them, but anyway, I mean...
Yes, I've seen those reports too. Fernando, what are those Russian planes sent to Iran carrying inside?
Supposedly, but this is very difficult. Basically, they're sending them anti-aircraft systems. There's even talk of the S-400.
S-400, right?
Probably. There's also talk, of course, that if they send them planes, they're sending them the famous MiG-29s, which they actually can send, because in fact the Russians are barely using them in the war in Ukraine, since they're interceptors.
And the Iranian pilots have experience with the old MiG planes left behind by the Soviet Union.
It must be said that the Iranian military aviation, which is why they hadn't paid much attention to it until now, was a wreck, a complete wreck. I mean, those planes belonged in a museum. They still had F-14s in operation, which is a miracle. I don't know how they managed to keep them flying, that were bought during the Shah's era back in the 70s.
Yes.
That was something else, really tremendous. They must have had 4 left, but anyway, a fleet of F-5s, things like that. I mean, terrible. By the way, the F-14 was a very good plane back in the day.
Very good, yes.
Yes.
Yes, a big plane.
He was the master of the sea, because it was a Navy plane that was used, well, it operated from aircraft carriers and was the great plane of the carriers. The thing is, it was so expensive that in the end, they said, all right, let's retire it and keep the F-18s, which are cheaper, because this one costs us a fortune. But they were excellent. Of course, one thing they could do, that kind of thing, would be, as I said, to carry out Resnik-type attacks in Ukraine, to see if those people come to their senses. If not, they could mainly target the Europeans, who are softer, and they could be attacked, for example, within Europe, at European arms factories. For instance, a Rheinmetall factory that was producing something for the Ukrainians. Well, that one, yes, and another one. Let's see if they get the message.
A ver si se enteran del mensaje. Que si no responden ante eso, no le va a quedar más remedio decir responde.
If they don't respond to that, they'll have no other choice. If they respond by de-escalating and seeking a solution, then they'll have to continue. If they keep escalating, then they'll have to do something tougher. And that's the problem, the one you pointed out. Of course, if we keep going like this, we'll end up with tactical nuclear weapons. They've said that, regarding the nuclear issue, they'll use reciprocal measures in principle. But reciprocal measures, meaning they've said, if the Americans, for example, carry out a nuclear test, we'll do one too. But it's understood that they won't use tactical missiles if the Europeans and Americans use them. This is part of Putin's extreme restraint, trying to limit responses as much as possible. We already know they have the Iskanders in Belarus.
Ya sabemos que tienen los Olesnik en Bielorrusia. Pero fíjate la cuestión. Es decir, cuando estamos hablando ya.
But look at the issue. When we're talking about weapons of a certain power, the Oleshnik are much more important than the Tomahawks. But well, like the Tomahawks, which only a few countries have. That is, the Americans don't sell these to just anyone, as if they were selling a tank or something like that. No. Very few countries, and NATO countries. So the question would be, well, I have to think about that. There are reasons, moreover, why I believe they won't take them there either, because they can't. That is, they would have to go themselves, set up in Ukraine, and bring soldiers. It makes no sense whatsoever. American soldiers to operate those missiles. And as I said, the Soviets, for example, have placed them in Belarus, but they're under Russian control. So no. One thing is to deploy them and have them more or less stationed there, that sort of thing. And let's not forget, we're talking about a state, Belarus, that has a union treaty with Russia, and supposedly at some point they're meant to more or less unify, form a confederation or whatever they decide to call it. So what I mean is that this kind of weaponry isn't given to just anyone, and even less would you directly involve yourself in a war just to hand over these weapons. I don't think NATO is going to give them away. What's happening is that they have to keep stalling for a while until Trump comes up with something else. I mean, Trump keeps stalling. Maybe I'll give them, maybe I won't. I'll think about it, we'll see. And what would you do with them? Clean windows or put them on a car to make it go faster? Well, those kinds of things, but...
But I think they're not going to give it to him. I mean, it's just not. Toward the end, we wanted to present a few little things, some gems, some pearls of geopolitics, but tied to humor, as always in the closing segment. 2,000 viewers connected and 1,250 likes. A bit low, right, Fernando?
Or maybe then the humor for next time better. Yes, because sometimes it's something really good. I mean, really funny.
But if there isn't, one of the main figures, very close to Fernando, the beloved Annalena, and then a newcomer here in the scene known as Mr. Bean, the Mr. Bean of Eurasian politics. The Mr. Bean of European politics. But that has to be your job. Let's deliberate, Fernando. 300 already, up to 1,500 likes. Let's wrap up with some humor, shall we? No? If not, then no. I agree with you, Fernando. I agree with you about the S-400s on those planes, Fernando. Essential for Iran. And well, we've already presented it here. That attack is imminent.
And above all, anti-aircraft systems. The Chinese have given them those too. There have been Chinese planes flying in recent days, for example. It's understood that they're getting ready for something that's obvious. There's going to be a war, or a second part of the war. Because the Americans keep preparing. It's not just that the aircraft carrier has arrived and taken position. No, they keep sending more stuff. So, well, it's so clear, so blatant, that the war is, I mean, I'm one of those who think it won't happen in October.
yo soy de los que pienso que de octubre no pasa. Es decir, que
De acuerdo, de acuerdo, de acuerdo, sí, de acuerdo, Fernando.
All right, all right, all right. Yes, agreed, Fernando. Or well, maybe next month, but not much later than that. And by the way, geopolitically, for both Russia and China, any collaboration with Iran at this moment brings almost exclusively geopolitical gains for both countries, because it would lead to a stalemate for the United States. In the case of direct US involvement, it would mean a deadlock for the United States there, an entry point, and suddenly another fire, another conflict hotspot, with no easy way out. For Israel, it would also create many difficulties. It's true that Russia, regarding Israel, has a rather particular policy. China, a bit less so. China is a bit more critical of Israel. But when it comes to the United States, it's all gain.
Pero con respecto a Estados Unidos, todo ganancia.
Claro, no, pero tendrían también problemas.
Of course, but they would also have problems. Problems because let's not forget that what neither the Chinese nor the Russians want is a regime change that would turn the place into chaos. A chaos fractured into different provinces. Here the Azeris, in the center the Iranians, here the Arabs, here the Turkmen, here the Baluch. What do the Americans want? In other words, a disorganized chaos.
Of course. But then the more strength they have, the more they can help the current regime, the lower the likelihood of that happening, of course.
Of course. But clearly we're in a situation where the Russians, let's not forget, are at war with the Ukrainians. They can help, but they can't do what they used to do before the war. In fact, there was a conversation in the past few days between Erdogan and Putin, and obviously they talked about this. Putin must have said something to him like, look, tone it down a bit because... And on the other hand, the Chinese are being bothered over the Silk Road. Let's not forget that they're already being messed with all along the route, on every path. That is, the northern route runs through Ukraine, which is cut off, and the move Poland made a couple of weeks ago has driven the Chinese into a state of hysteria. The thing is, the Poles taking advantage of the Azaz maneuvers, I think they were called, right? Zapad 2025. Zapad 2025. They said we're closing the Polish border because these maneuvers are very dangerous and so on. The maneuvers ended and the Poles said, well, no, the border will remain completely closed. And the Chinese were losing money because all the trains arriving in Europe through the route that doesn't work, the northern one, were stuck in Belarus, unable to cross into Poland. Until Chinese pressure made Donald Trump, right there at the United Nations Assembly, have to come out and say, no, I've ordered my ministers to immediately open the border. In other words, they no longer trust the Poles. They could get played again. That leaves them with the middle route. But what happens? The middle route is the one that goes through Kazakhstan and heads toward the Caspian. But there we have the Americans and the Europeans, well, mostly the Americans, who on the one hand are provoking this past weekend the fifth color revolution against Georgia, trying to take down the Georgian government. And the Azerbaijanis and Armenians have sided with the Americans, so to speak, in a very... So then you think, uh-oh, that middle route, which has to go through Azerbaijan, through Baku, they can cut it off whenever they feel like it. And watch out, the southern route, which they've strengthened in recent months by opening new train lines and so on. But of course, the southern route inevitably goes through Iran. If you throw Iran into chaos, goodbye to the southern route. That leaves you with the maritime ones, which are complicated, because the usual maritime route goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and then through the Suez Canal. And the one they're promoting like crazy because they see they have no other option, the northern route.
Yes, but that one still. Of course that one has problems.
Of course. So right now the Chinese are saying these bunch of idiots are going to cut off all land trade with Europe, which is key. In other words, they have no interest at all in seeing Iran fall, because they also know it's a strategic ally of China, And if Iran falls, that's one less ally, and it makes it easier to go after the Chinese.
Y si cae Irán, pues uno menos que queda y más facilidad para ir a por los chinos. Ya lo están haciendo, ¿eh?
Sí, no, efectivamente.
Entonces,
They're already doing it, yes indeed. And there, very close to the south of the Caucasus, close to the south of Russia as well. For Russia and for China, the US presence there would create enormous problems, and the US getting bogged down in Iran would cause many difficulties for the United States against Russia and China. That's why, for me, it's all a gain. Any support for Iran. The Iranians so far have signed agreements with both powers, but not mutual defense agreements. Well, that would perhaps be a bigger step. But they should have established anti-air systems long ago. They should have established them. This thing about always being surprised by Israeli attacks.
Esto de que siempre sorprendidos por los ataques israelíes.
They had their own systems, but they're not bad. Still, they're not at the level of the Chinese or the Russians. I mean, they had the S-300, for example, but it's not the same. And in the end, well, supposedly they've learned their lesson from the 12-Day War, and right now they're preparing better. That's what it seems like. We'll see later, though, but...
Ya veremos luego, pero...
A propósito de preparaciones, Fernando, aquí...
Speaking of preparations, Fernando, here's your dearest Annalena, always well prepared. Pay attention to this, the part you don't see in the interview.
La parte que no ves en la entrevista.
Oh, really? Oh. But how could they think of giving him such a tall interviewer?
Exactly. What's the problem? The interviewer is taller than her. That's why she's standing on a little box there.
This is where they put the Coca-Cola bottles or whatever and stuff there.
A crate of bottles, right?
Yeah. Or beers. Yeah, it's the typical thing you bring along, the case of beers and all that.
And with a little wooden board, right?
Let's not mess this up or we'll be in trouble. It's being recorded on video.
Now, what a complex these leaders have. Not just Annalena in this case, but also Macron, Zelensky with those platforms. What's the problem if one person is a bit shorter than another? These people have so many hang-ups, so insecure, such an inferiority complex. How stupid. Anyway, we present a new contender in the race for the...
It enters the ranking with great strength and promises to give us a lot of satisfaction. Yes.
With you, Dorin Rashan, the Prime Minister of Moldova, put there by the European Union, obviously.
No, from Romania, right? Isn't it from Romania?
Oh. No, from Moldova, born in Moldova. More or less the same thing. Yes, Minister of the Interior of Moldova between 2002 and 2015, and since 16th Prime Minister of Moldova since February 2023. Maybe this Moldovan government wants the Anschluss, unification with Romania, so it's more or less the same. Well, pay attention here. Any resemblance to Mr. Bean is not a coincidence. Pay attention to this. Pay attention to this man.
Atención a esto. Atención a este señor. A ver.
Mr. Bean, this guy.
He doesn't know what to do. I'm going over there. No!
Sí, que voy para allá. Me voy al otro lado. No, para allá no. ¿Qué hago? Siga usted, hombre.
Bueno, esa no la única.
Well, that's not the only one. Pay attention here. He's confronted by someone angry with this man, and with good reason. Someone sees him going up an escalator, and listen to the shout. Slave.
Esclavo.
Слуга сорочиста.
esclavo de Soros. Y el tipo ahí, medio...
Soros' slave. And the guy there, kind of lost. You made a fool of yourself in front of the cathedral, apparently. Just now, and the police already there like, no, no, sir, expressions of discontent. Yeah, he was speaking in Russian, the 4 words he knows in Russian, and he's saying, suka.
Suka isn't what they put there.
Something much stronger, stronger.
It's like screwed, or screw you, or something like that, but harsher in Russian. This is said when the next step is going to be a fight, because if someone says this to you, it's really serious.
Just like several episodes of Mr. Bean, in different places. One at the airport, another at the restaurant. Problems everywhere. This one here with other prime ministers, here with Macron. Yes, yes, pay attention to this one, it's incredible. The one on the right, the one on the right, pay attention.
Increíble, el de la derecha, atención, Que sí, que no.
Yes, the one on the right is our man. Yes, no, What do I do? Should I go for it? Should I put it on? Oh, I'm getting nervous, I'm shy. It makes me feel weird, like I'm fading a little. And we're just standing there saying, all right, come on, we've taken the picture. And I remember I keep talking to this lady, I don't even know who she is, but anyway, let's get the photo done, it's just for the photo, we need it for the photo. And that's it, the photo's done, you can go now. Even the gestures, kind of like Mr. Bean with those looks and all. Well, this man shows promise. We'll be keeping a close eye on him because, remember that name, Doran Ressian.
Fernando querido, un placer como siempre.
Fernando, my dear, a pleasure as always. The talk is starting, or actually started a little while ago, most likely. Eduardo Bior, the name of today's program, I can't recall it from memory right now. Let me check. Today's topic on Eduardo's show, does the war in Iran facilitate peace in Gaza? Interesting. Will peace in Gaza speed up an attack on Iran or not? That's today's topic with Eduardo Bior. To all the demolishers, men and women, thank you very much for joining us. To Beatriz Pulido, our moderator, demolisher number 1 as always, 1,000 thanks as well. We'll be back tomorrow with our live Thursday broadcast. Fernando will be here Friday on DMP Geopolitics, and Sunday, once again, with me here for the talks.
Y el domingo nuevamente conmigo aquí en las charlas, ¿verdad, Fernando, querido?
Right, Fernando, my dear. Indeed, now when the show ends, about 15 minutes left, I'm going out to the balcony because around that time some drones fly by and I want to see them. They're very pretty and all that. Well now, whenever you like a message for you, instead of carrier pigeons, we could use a Russian messenger drone, but in Russian, written in Cyrillic, written in Russian. Well, no problem. Any AI gadget can translate it for you now, of course. That is to say, in fact, I've already been told that messaging services, WhatsApp and so on, all of those, and emails and such, are going to be replaced by drones. Russian drones, of course. So they'll send drones here and so on. If they want to send you an email, they'll just send you a Russian drone flying around, doing, who knows, bad things in the gray zone, and while it's at it, it delivers the email.
That is to say, a good name for an 80s rock album, Danger, Russian Drones. Dear Fernando, a hug and see you soon.
Abrazo y hasta pronto.
Bye-bye.